Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice seeing a lot of familiar faces again. I really look forward to these annual events. As a physician, I'm quite well aware of the gastroocular ligament. This is the ligament that runs from your stomach to your eyelids. And as your stomach fills, it pulls your eyelids close. So we'll try to keep this informative and moving forward. 2015 was a very, very busy year for emerging infectious diseases. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to Médecins Sans Frontières and their heroic actions in West Africa. Well, just as a quick review, when we talk of emerging infectious diseases, we're talking of infections that have newly appeared, we've never seen before in a human population, or they're known infections, but they're rapidly increasing in incidence or expanding in their geographic range, even to other countries or other continents. Most of these have a readily identifiable source, although it may take 20 to 30 years to find it. And they're most often an animal virus, usually an RNA virus, that's been given an opportunity to infect a new host population. So this transmission of viruses from animals to humans to other species we call viral trafficking. Environmental and social changes can accelerate viral traffic and consequently increase the risk of new emerging diseases. During the past 30 years, we've had 43 new infectious diseases jump from their wild animal hosts into humans. This rate will only increase as our population density increases. Risk factors for emerging viral disease, an ever-expanding global human population. This is very particular in Africa, where the population of Southern Africa has doubled in the last 27 years, in spite of HIV. With this expanding human population comes fragmentation and destruction of native animal habitats. Wild animal food sources become less diverse. Animals start hanging closer around human populations. Another factor is Western practice of and Chinese. Intensive domestic animal breeding for food. This encourages viral mixing and spillover from the animal's wild cousins into the domestic herds and flocks. Changes in the insect vector level or animal reservoir migrations can spread these diseases. And again, the biggest risk comes from the RNA viruses. Every time an RNA virus reproduces, it tends to make a mistake in copying its genetic material. HIV patient, I think the record is 28 different strains of HIV isolated from one patient. And we're seeing this in West Africa in the Ebola outbreak. These patients will have 3 or 4 mutated strains that can be isolated and sequenced out of their blood. We have a new worry and a new phenomena that it's called syndemic. And this is when a population is affected by 2 or more emerging viruses at the same time. And the synergistic actions of these 2 viruses on the human host. An example may be HIV and human herpes virus 8. And test tube and tissue culture studies we've been shown with human spleen explants in raft collagen histoculture to show that this does produce HIV, Kaposi sarcoma. So you see, this is very difficult to predict. There's a lot of factors involved, and if you look at this Venn diagram, we have all these dynamics of wild animal virus reservoirs. Migration patterns of the animals, breeding times, population densities, and where this overlaps with human contact and a particular RNA virus in a population, this is where we can get spillover. So there's a lot of factors involved in this, both on the human and the animal side. The outcomes can be no human disease produced. If we go to the Congo, we see a lot of the native inhabitants, the pygmy population. They're running very high levels of antibodies to simian foamy virus. This is a monkey disease. But there's no disease produced by this. That's one outcome. We could have a recognized human disease outbreak, something like Ebola. Or we can have an unrecognized human disease that sits there and simmers until it finally becomes apparent. Sort of the description for HIV. Well, in 2014 to 15, as you're aware, there was a very large outbreak in West Africa of the Ebola virus. This serves to me as a very good example of complete mismanagement of an infectious disease outbreak, both the national and international level. And I'd like to just run through what's happened since our last meeting, where this had just started. Risks of Ebola infection: eating bushmeat, people eating tasty animals. Protein is a very scarce commodity in these overpopulated areas of Africa. And any source of protein, termites are a very popular snack, rats, monkeys, and all of this thing brings humans in contact with wild animals. Obviously, the animals don't like being eaten. They don't like being skinned. We carry multiple abrasions on our hands right now. Every one of us have microscopic abrasions on the hands, coming in contact with fresh animal blood, and this sets the stage for viral trafficking. Attending the funerals of Ebola victims, contact with Ebola case patients, laboratory accidents. The question of infected paper money has cropped up. Whether it's paper or polymer notes, some recent experiments in the laboratory have shown that the Ebola virus can surprisingly remain viable for hours on currency, as long as it's not exposed to ultraviolet light, sunlight. We know that contact with at least 3 species of fruit bat, possibly several species of insectivorous bats. The insectivorous bats aren't confirmed yet, but it's been shown to be possible in the laboratory. And then the question of bat guano. Viruses and aerosols tend to decay relatively quickly. Ebola and its relative Marburg can last really a number of hours in the air. If they're surrounded by other organic material, such as guano, it acts as a protective mechanism for these viruses. It stops their oxidation and their osmotic disruption. And it's never really been fully researched now, but there's high index of suspicion that bat droppings from an infected bat do contain live virus. We know the host range has expanded a bit over the last 10 years. We know that pigs can carry Ebola Zaire, and they can aerosol transmit it. Duikers, which are tiny little cute antelope, they've been found to harbor Ebola infection. Monkeys, it's well known. The question of dogs in the village. We go in, we do a antibody screen. You can find seropositivity in the dogs, meaning they've been exposed to Ebola, but they don't seem to show overt disease. As time progresses, we're going to be focusing a lot more on pigs in the villages and this type of thing as possible reservoirs. So there's a management triad for any sort of highly infectious, emerging infectious disease that has no vaccine or definitive treatment. The main thing is to have a high index of suspicion and some sort of surveillance mechanism in place to identify and quickly isolate confirmed or suspected cases. This is paramount to any control of an Ebola epidemic. Second is the ability to perform contact tracing. I have an infected case here, who are they in contact with? and they need to be isolated and tested. And then lastly, safe burial practices. Now, in this part of the world, the burial practices are a lot different than here. Typically, the family takes the body home, manually washes it. In some tribes, they clean out the body orifices. So there's a lot of handling of the dead body. And this has contributed significantly to the spread of Ebola in the past African outbreaks. So this is something that has to be controlled. We'll touch more on this a little bit later. But if you fail to perform any one of these three legs of the triad, your epidemic is going to continue or it's going to reassert. The start of the West African outbreak was sometime in December 2013 in Malandio village, which is depicted here in Guinea, West Africa. Children found some bats in a small tree. These animals are, I've not tried one, but apparently they're very tasty. It is a source of protein. The kids went in and clubbed them, brought them home. And on Christmas Day, the epidemic officially started when a 2-year-old boy died in this village. His older sister died 9 days later, followed by the mother, who was 7 months pregnant, who hemorrhaged and died. We have never had a case of a pregnant female survive Ebola infection. The grandmother, who was busy cleaning the hut from the blood and the vomiting and the feces, fell ill, and she went to another village for treatment, spreading the virus. It silently spread for about 3 months with about 50 deaths, and in March 2014, it was recognized that this was an Ebola outbreak. The Ministry of Health in Guinea informed the WHO, the World Health Organization, that an outbreak of Ebola virus was underway, and the Guinean government had no idea how to respond. Médecins Sans Frontières came to the rescue, and they set up a field hospital right in the center of the outbreak, which by now was involving 15 different villages. This is an ideal Ebola treatment facility, not a high-tech, negative pressure BSL-3 room. This is how these things should be managed. Viruses, fomite spread, liquid spread, this type of thing, contact. If you have a high ambient ultraviolet light level from sunlight, this serves to fairly quickly inactivate these viruses. It forms dimers between the nucleoside base pairs. These are naturally ventilated, these flaps come up, so you have a very high airflow exchange. Also, there's a high ambient humidity. In controlled negative pressure rooms, you don't have that. And one thing that viruses do not like is a high ambient humidity. It serves to osmotically disrupt them if they're not surrounded by other organic matter. Okay? So this is absolutely ideal. The only suggestions is, we now think, because of bad guano, these trees need to be cut down. You really don't want fruit bats nesting around, roosting around your Ebola treatment center. WHO regional office was contacted in the capital city, 400 miles away, and they did absolutely nothing except hold daily confusing meetings. Nobody seemed to have a clue what to do. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, warned the government that this epidemic is unprecedented, and the Guinean government said that Doctors Without Borders was overreacting. Their Ministry of Health intentionally underreported the death count for political reasons. Contact tracing was stopped for all but laboratory-confirmed cases. And this is a process that takes a week to a week and a half because all the samples had to be sent to the labs in the Ivory Coast that the U.S. helped put in 10 years ago or more. By late May, the outbreak had spread to the Guinea's capital, a city of about 2 million inhabitants. Panic ensued, Dead family members were removed from the houses and just left in the streets. And this is real type wrath of God type thing occurring. Sometime in March, Ebola entered through the porous borders. Cases got into Sierra Leone. And on April 8th, a very now renowned female Nyanga, this is a witch doctor, traditionally healer, dies of Ebola in Mindonor. She was very famous. They held a traditional burial for her. Hundreds passed by the body and touched it, and this triggered an epidemic chain reaction throughout the country. The government had a contract with the Metabiota company, a European company, doing something there, and they gave them the wrong advice. Again, the WHO really was nowhere to be seen. The government set up a state hospital treatment center, which was quickly overrun with patients. Nurses, doctors began to die. Corpses started to pile up. And finally, Médecins Sans Frontières was called in to Sierra Leone. They found no list of patients, no list of villages, no contact tracing system, no surveillance system. By May to July 2014, the virus reached Monrovia in Liberia. 3 countries are now involved. Total death tolls around 800. WHO considers calling an emergency, but officials are worried about causing a panic. They open a useless coordination center in Guinea. Again, more useless meetings. There's no leadership, and there's no impact at all on the epidemic at the field level. In Liberia, day 183 of the epidemic, the Kenanyama Government Hospital in Liberia becomes overwhelmed. Nurses and doctors are dying. The hospital remains open. And then down in the central marketplace, the rumor starts that the hospital is killing patients for their organs. A riot ensues. The police come in, use tear gas. WHO still refuses to declare an emergency. And about this time, 2 American missionary healthcare workers in West Africa become infected. Very lovely Gulfstream jet there. And this patient isolator, it was determined they would be brought back to the United States. These isolators, I've never seen this one before until I saw it on television. If this aircraft loses pressurization, so explosively decompresses, there's a big worry that these panels blow out. This happened, the U.S. Air Force did some testing on our own isolators years ago, and this was one of the problems. Up until 2010, we had a very specialized Army unit out of Fort Detrick, a team called the Aeromedical Isolation Team. They were designed to go in and bring doctors and scientists out of Africa that had become infected with these diseases. They were good at it. They had worldwide aeromedical evacuation capability. They practiced all the time. We'll talk more about this, but they were dissolved in 2010 as part of the Obama budget cuts. Anyway, this Gulfstream transports the first patient, the doctor, to Atlanta, to Emory, where they have a biosafety level 3 treatment facility. The suits that they were wearing, I don't see signs of positive pressure inside the suits, and we'll go into that in a bit later too. So 3 Ebola cases are now in the U.S. CDC response is unsafe and inconsistent. And everybody seems to forget we made this a biosafety level pathogen for a number of very good reasons. One, we don't know a lot about the virus. We don't know a lot about transmissibility. The things that we have learned about it made the people that work with it have a very great sense of caution. This is biosafety level 4. These are the encapsulating spacesuits with HEPA filters on a separate airline. When you leave the facility, you undergo a decontamination process where every square inch of the outside of the suit is disinfected and then rinsed. This is biosafety level 3. You have an air purifying respirator. usually an N95, and an outer Tyvek suit, double gloves, boots, and hopefully this is all disinfected before you leave the hot area. With lethal RNA viruses, you can never suppose. These things are constantly changing. What you see in one epidemic may not be what you see in the other one. It may be less transmissibility, it may be more. But this is an evolving thing. You must always err on the side of caution. U.S. health authorities claim that simple gowns and masks with unprotected skin areas and no full decontamination is sufficient protection. When I heard this on the news, I lost my mind. When Anthony Fauci claims that a single layer of gloves is safe to work with Ebola patients, it was clear that Ebola had now become political. Dr. Fauci is a physician, a very famous researcher. He did a lot for the collagen diseases, polyarteritis nodosa. He'd been in charge of the HIV program for a number of years, some of the orphan disease research. So this is just not making any sense. A number of false statements were made unsupported by published peer-reviewed scientific evidence that fever is an early, reliable presenting sign in Ebola virus infection. And our international screening systems that we put into the airports, the thermal scanners. A study of the West African outbreak, while it was underway, showed that 12.9% of cases never ran a fever. So did you have this your only goal in a poorly worded questionnaire? I didn't feel that this was sufficient. The statement was repeatedly made that airborne transmission of the Ebola virus cannot occur. And in classical outbreaks that we've seen previously in Africa over the last 35 years, this is true. It really didn't seem to be a factor. But the only way that we know really that Ebola is transmitted through laboratory experiments is by injection and aerosol transmission. A number of studies have been done this, and we're talking semantics here, because it's well agreed that if you get a bit of Ebola in your eye, you're going to get infected. Well, what if somebody coughs and it's an infected drop of saliva? We know the virus is in the saliva. And you get that in your eye, you're going to get infected. So these experiments were never mentioned by U.S. authorities. And we still have uncertainty at this time of the amount of Ebola virus actually shed by an infected patient. We know we find it in all body secretions, tears, saliva, respiratory secretion. We're just not sure when in the disease the maximum amount of this shedding occurs. And this is a factor that may vary between different Ebola strains. So, from a biomedical viewpoint, aerosol transmission of the Ebola virus has been demonstrated in animals, and human-human aerosol transmission is possible under certain conditions. We know this from the Reston Ebola virus outbreak in Virginia. I assume you're all aware of that. This is a non-human pathogenic strain of Ebola. It broke out in a primate holding colony, in the Hazelden primate holding colony in Reston. And several workers seroconverted. They were exposed, but nobody got ill. The Philippines, Ebola Reston, the same. They've had repeated outbreaks there. And then from classified Soviet biological warfare tests, we knew it was aerosol transmitted. Irrespective of that, one of the main targets of infection is the skin. This is immunohistochemistry staining of what's called Langerhans cells. These are specialized antigen-presenting cells in your skin. They're designed to see new microbial organisms, configure them, and present them to the immune system for an immune response. This is the cornified layer of skin and the basal cell layer that's constantly making new cells. The cells are keratinized and they shed off into the environment. Well, this virus is being actively secreted into the extracellular space all around here, and you can see that it's a quite easy mechanism for this virus to end up on the outer cornified layers of the skin. The presence of Ebola virus transmission and presence in the skin of infected cases was suggested clear back in 1995 in Kitwit. During the outbreak, they showed that simple skin swabs showed abundant viral proteins and Ebola viral particles in the skin. We know that contact transmission, touching a dead body, is enough to give you an infection. The question is the timing of when live viral particles appear in the skin, and this is not well documented during early infection. We don't really sure when you start to shed virus from your skin. So these studies still need to be done. Still unresolved at this time. When and where does the viral shedding occur? What stage during the acute period of illness? When you consider that as little as 10 Ebola virus particles can cause human infection, in some cases, I think it's down to 1 or 2. This needs to be better clarified with very early patients. A year later, the doctor that recovered still has live Ebola virus in the aqueous humor of his eye. Following, of course, we had secondary cases in Texas. Following these 2 confirmed cases, new CDC guidelines were issued, and it was changed from this outfit to this outfit, with the addition that exterior decontamination by chemical wipes on visible contamination on the outside only was sufficient. What this indicated to me was we couldn't even handle 3 Ebola patients without major drama. Yet over the last 10 years, we've spent $120 billion on domestic preparedness. And if you spend this on biological warfare defense, biological terrorism, it should be immediately adaptable to emerging disease outbreaks. And it just fell apart. New recommendations, double gloves are now recommended. Use of respirators, N95 filters, or if you're using powered air purifying respirator, P100s. Well, why do you need respirators if the CDC says aerosol transmission is not a factor in infection? It just doesn't make sense. People aren't stupid. They see everyone running around in full protective suits. You're being told it's not aerosol transmitted, and you wonder why there's a high level of suspicion in what's going on. The guidance is general. It allows a particular hospital to select personal protective equipment for their own protocols based on availability and preference while trying to provide some degree of standardized protection. The lack of full-body outer decontamination requirement means that this CDC protocol is not as safe as the ones being used in rural Africa by Médecins Sans Frontières. On a positive note, the single-use Gentex patient isolator is now promoted as the standard for U.S. aeromedical transport. We contacted the people involved in transporting these patients in the Air Force, and they'd never seen this thing before. As a result of these 3 patients, over 10,000 contact tracings had to be performed in the USA. During this time, the Liberia outbreak spins completely out of control. It breaks out in the densely populated slum called West Point in Monrovia. Liberia still has no resources, no understanding of the rapidity of spread, nowhere for the infected to go, no doctors, no medicine, no supplies. They pick an old school building to be used as an isolation center, but there's no separation between suspected cases and non-infected cases. Finally, the WHO director, Margaret Chan, declares an international emergency. Geneva team is organized, but it needs thousands of healthcare workers. It has no resources budgeted, and it just reveals itself to be essentially useless. Bunch of medical bureaucrats. April 16th, day 233 of the epidemic. Obviously, you don't want locked in your slum if there's a lethal infectious disease raging. So they have riots and protests. The common belief that Ebola is a hoax to kill poor Africans. They overrun the isolation center. They steal infected mattresses and bedding from the hospital, take it back to the slum. And eventually the police move in and quarantine the entire area, and the army ends up killing several people. The epidemic now spreads even faster. MSF, again, arise to the occasion. They construct the largest Ebola treatment center ever built. This is still not enough, and this center becomes immediately overwhelmed. Advanced cases are arriving at the hospital and dying before they can be admitted. Scarce resources now have to be directed to go back into the slum and start removing the bodies and decontaminating the dwellings. And these local healthcare workers are the true heroes of this entire episode, because they mounted the horse and they rode into battle. At the same time, the MSF treatment facilities in Guinea and Sierra Leone are also completely overwhelmed. U.S. public interest wanes even as the death toll continues to rise. This is U.S. Google Trends Ebola searches. There was a big spike when the first American patient arrived. It quickly dropped off. Another huge spike when Ebola was diagnosed in Dallas and the secondary transmission to the healthcare workers. And another spike October 23rd when the New York City doctor was walking around New York City. And then it fell off. And cases continued to rise almost exponentially in Africa. So we have a short memory. The U.S. Army begins to train for deployment to Liberia 10 months after the outbreak. Liberia and the U.S. have very close connections. They use the American dollar. They have a version of the American flag. It used to be U.S. territory. We purchased it, I think, after the Civil War. So we've constantly kind of tried to look after Liberia. Anyway, the task of this military team will be to train local burial teams for that other triad of infection control and build multiple new Ebola treatment centers. Colonel Howard Murphy here finished command. He was in charge of burning up Syria's chemical weapons stockpile, and he finished that, and he was immediately retasked to lead the construction of these multiple new Ebola treatment centers. He's an old and dear friend, and we've worked on multiple projects in the past together. A good man. October 2014, cases finally began to drop in Monrovia. The Liberians stopped nursing their sick themselves. The dead are being safely buried, and the disease starts to plateau off. Several months later, the case numbers are low enough that a new treatment trial was set to begin for chemotherapy, but it was stopped for lack of sufficient numbers. The drug is brencidofovir. It's a relative of cidofovir, which we use. It's shown effectivity in smallpox, experimental animal models of smallpox. I had an accident with monkeypox. I got the drug myself. I don't see any ill effects. So it's mass-produced. Gilead make it. We've heard about Gilead before. But it appears to, the first American cases got it, and the secondary cases got it as well, in addition to a cocktail of 3 monoclonal antibodies. Normally, once you start the rash, this is the end of you with Ebola. And they've saved these U.S. cases. Current status, as of last month, death toll for West Africa, somewhere around 12,000 deaths, and more than 20,700 people have been infected on top of that since the outbreak began. We're still seeing about 20 cases per week in Sierra Leone and Guinea, and 6 out of 10 of these cases will die. There are systems in place now for surveillance, contact tracing, testing, isolation systems. Last 2 weeks ago, a 6-year-old vaccine finished its phase 2 tests, and it appears to work. It's a modified vesicular stomatitis virus, which is known, it's an animal virus. It's known to affect a wide variety of cell types in humans. And it really looks like we may have a vaccine now. July 17th, last month, new outbreak of Ebola begins. This West African outbreak is a precedent. It's not an anomaly. And it's an example of when a new type of emerging infectious disease hits a densely populated region of what can happen if measures aren't put into place. The previous Ebola outbreaks have been small villages separated by 20, 30 miles from other villages, and they've burnt themselves out. This was high-density population, and it's a warning. Other emerging disease events occurred during 2014 to 15, but these were overshadowed by the Ebola outbreak. Influenza A. There's 3 types of influenza, A, B, and C. B, not too worried about. C, humans only. But influenza A can be transmitted by birds. It can be transmitted by pigs. There's 11 genes on the RNA here, and these genes are separated into 8 pieces of RNA. The 2 genes that were very important in infection are the hemagglutinin gene. This is a glycoprotein, and it's a spike protein, and its job is to bind to the target cell and allow the virus to enter, to replicate. The other protein of importance is the neuraminidase protein, and this is like a suction cup. When the virus is replicated and matured and formed into active viral particles, it sticks to the inner part of the cell membrane and allows the influenza virus to come out. Well, there's different genetic variations of these 2 proteins. There's 16 variations of the hemagglutinin protein, and there's 9 variations of the neuraminidase protein. The problem is, if you put these into something like a pig and you have an avian influenza and a human influenza, it's like taking 8 pieces of different length sticks, putting them in a cup, shaking it, and seeing what comes out. You get recombination. The pathogenicity seems to be mainly dependent upon the hemagglutinin protein. This is the one that allows the virus to enter cells. In mild disease-causing strains, the virus can only enter the cells in sort of the trachea and the upper bronchi and the throat. The highly virulent strains, such as H5N1, the hemagglutinin can be cleaved by a wide variety of other proteases, and you can get deep lung infections and, quite severe death. China is a center for new influenza strain production. It's because of their process of dense polyaquaculture. They raise pigs together with ducks, chickens, and you get this wild virus mixing going between humans, avian, and swine. And you get all these new different recombinations. Every year, we have CDC offices over in China, and new samples are constantly coming into these centers, and the CDC tries to make a prediction which of these strains is going to go pandemic and arrive in America. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they miss it, but this is where your annual flu vaccine comes from. It's a best guess because it takes about 6 months to make enough vaccine for everyone. How these viruses get from epicenter in China, they're spread by migrating birds. The Arctic tern is a strange little animal. It flies to the North Pole, and when it gets there, it rests, and then it flies back to the South Pole. That's all it does. And when it does that, it poops on things. And the poops have live virus in it. Seasonal risk for the Northern Hemisphere, November to April. For the Southern Hemisphere, from April back to November, and equatorially year-round. We have some drugs for this. The two most popular ones are Tamiflu and Relenza. And what this does, it acts on the neuraminidase protein and it stops the virus from getting out of the cell. We've already seen drug-resistant strains. What's of note is the U.S. stockpiled $1.5 billion worth of Tamiflu. The efficacy of this drug is uncertain. Roche never did comply with requests for full clinical study reports, their study protocols, their reporting analysis plan, their statistical analysis plan, and individual patient data. This is because in the 90s, the USDA determined that the drug companies would do their clinical trials themselves rather than the FDA. There's quite a bit of good evidence now showing this drug is probably useless. If you will take it exactly when you start to get symptoms, you'll shorten your disease course by about a day, and it's never been shown to have any effect at all on the hospitalization rate. 2014, two new strains of pathogenic avian flu appear. The H7N9 becomes epizootic in eastern China, causing infections and fatalities in humans and birds. Human infections with avian H6N1, we never thought humans could get infected with this, and cases were described. 2015, there was a large outbreak of avian flu in the U.S., not a human pathogen, but on December 2014, H5N2 was reported in Oregon. This turned into a massive outbreak involving large-scale chicken farmers, affected almost 40 million turkeys and chickens, and we're talking about a tremendous amount of viral traffic back and forth here. That is the graph for infection in the United States. As of 4/7/15, virus is still being reported. More than 10% of the entire U.S. egg supply was affected by the outbreak. Farmers were forced to slaughter to stop this viral mixing their hens by the millions. Why are we worried about avian influenza? It's because of the 1918 influenza pandemic. A precursor virus became harbored in birds, recombined with pigs in China, and a respiratory illness almost identical to that described for the 1918 flu broke out in northern China in November 1917. World War I was underway, and some 60,000 Chinese laborers were used behind the front lines. Most people don't know that. 1918, it broke out in France, and it broke out in Spain. The French called it the Spanish flu. I don't know what the Spanish called it. As the U.S. became firmly entrenched in World War I, and we're talking massive movements and relocations of young men under high-density living conditions, and it broke out in Fort Riley, October 1918, and these are the wards that had to be set up, and the game was on. Unlike previous outbreaks, this one affected young males, young people with very good immune systems. The very young and the old were relatively spared the mortality. There's reasons for this, we understand now why. But the disease spread worldwide within months. It was a global disaster. The infected migratory birds took it into remote, isolated Eskimo villages and decimated them. Years later, century later, scientist Jeffrey Taubenberg was able to recover some of these bodies and actually sequence the 1918 virus. We have its genetic code. Killed some 50 to 100 million people, which was 3 to 5% of the world's population at that time. Final death toll, countries like India suffered more influenza deaths over a 6-month period than had been killed by 20 years of cholera epidemics. Worldwide, the disease killed more victims than all the armies of the 4 years of World War I. More people died of influenza in a single year than in the 4 years of the Black Death bubonic plague in the early 1300s. The final worldwide death toll was so great that the 1918 influenza epidemic is put with the classical worst infectious disease outbreaks known to man, the bubonic plagues of Justinian and the Black Death. The world's population now is 5 times larger than in 1918, and the same influenza strain with the same lethality would now kill over 380 million people. Recent GAO report shows the shocking ineptitude and millions of wasted dollars in influenza preparedness in the United States. There's another very serious factor that we have to think about, and these are the mega cities. In the United States, we have New York and we have San Francisco. There's 19 of these in the world. Shanghai, 23 million. Laos, Nigeria, 20 million people. Associated with this is that more than 2 billion people in the world now live in high-density shanty towns, where conditions are ideal for spread by aerosol and direct contact of any infectious disease. There's an additional problem, and it deals with interconnectivity and complexity. Most metropolitan areas really have no more than 72 hours worth of food and fuel for its inhabitants. You try stockpiling that close to the state, you're going to tax you on your warehouse. Billions of urban human beings are totally dependent on very complex systems of agricultural food production, transport, manufacturing, supermarkets. Delivery trucks are dependent on an even more complex system of fuel transport to individual gas stations and truck stops. These are dependent upon manufactured fuel from the refineries. What this leads to is something I call the 30% estimate. We're not sure at what value this really is. Some of the people that deal with chaos theory have tried to calculate this. I don't even pretend to understand chaos theory. But what it means is that all these systems are interlinked closely, and they depend upon a constant, reliable infrastructure and a constant, reliable level of workforce. A major failure anywhere in this system can cause a sudden catastrophic collapse of the whole thing. 30% is a rough estimate. If we lost suddenly 30% of our workforce over a couple weeks, the whole thing collapses. Other animal die-offs, and I like to watch these very closely because it tells me really, in my opinion, what the environment's doing. The West Nile outbreak that occurred in the 90s, our first indication was dead crows. And the CDC were holding New York Public Health were holding a press conference out in the park, and some guy held a dead crow up and said, "Does this have anything to do with it? These are all over my lawn." So, March 2015, snow geese were literally falling out of the sky due to avian cholera. 2,000 died migrating north. We don't know where they picked this up during the migration from their wintering grounds in American Southwest and Mexico. May 11th, 2015, the Saiga antelope is a leftover from the Pleistocene, like the muskox. The woolly mammoths didn't make it, the woolly rhinoceros, but this silly-looking thing made it. And there's about 250,000 of these things still alive on the steppes in Kazakhstan. On May 11th, they started dying, and 40% of the entire population died within 2 weeks. It was 100% mortality in the infected flocks. Animal health experts are over there still trying to research this. They suspect a respiratory virus. I'm not so sure. Nothing ever kills 100% of anything in the infectious disease world. There were a couple rockets out of Balkanor that exploded, and I don't know the effects of hydrazine on grass if you eat it. But that's sort of an alternate theory of what may have happened. Anyway, it's going to be interesting to see how this develops. 2014 to 15, other emerging disease outbreaks. Virus we've never seen before called the bourbon virus. Killed a farmer in Kansas in 2014. It was finally identified in 2015. It was named after the county in which the farmer lived. The case is the first time that a Thagota virus has been shown to cause human illness in the United States. There's 8 known cases. Genome is similar to viruses that have been found in Eastern Europe, Africa, and in Asia, but we've never seen a Thagota virus in the United States before. It's carried by ticks, we believe. The enterovirus 68, August to October 2014. Respiratory disease, some indications that could cause a polio-like disorder called acute flaccid myelitis. Caused clusters of respiratory disease in the United States. By mid-October, 691 cases in 46 states. 5 children die. I can't find papers on this, but the timing is coincidental with when we had that immigrant rush of children coming out of Central and South America, and they were relocated to homes in the Midwest. 2013 to 15, emerging disease at the Gulf of Mexico, Vibrio vulnificus, related to Vibrio cholera, found in the coastal areas of the Gulf of Mexico. You have an abrasion, you get this germ in this by being in the ocean, and it takes your limb off. You die of septicemia. If you eat it in raw oysters, symptoms start in 7 hours, and you're dead in a couple days. This is untreated, 10 hours after infection, 36 hours after infection. That all has to be surgically removed. April and July, a new emerging infectious disease discovered in northeast and central China. This is a flebovirus. It's a Bunyaviridae. Most of the Bunyaviridae are transmitted by, well, not most, but some are transmitted by ticks. And we think this is probably tick-borne. Fatality rates from 12 to 30%. We think genetically this virus originated about 50 to 150 years ago, and it's undergone a recent population expansion. We need to look at the ecology of this thing and see what happened and why it got into humans. August 2014, chikungunya virus in Puerto Rico. This is a disease of Africa. In Swahili, it means walking stooped over. 1 to 12 day incubation period, sudden onset chills, fever, headache, and a skin rash, mobiliform skin rash. Severe arthralgia for up to 3 weeks. You're afraid that you won't die. Occasional hemorrhagic symptoms in children. By 2015, it's become a notifiable disease in the United States. In Puerto Rico, there were 97 locally transmitted cases. It's in the mosquitoes there. 237 cases as of July 21st of this year, reported from 34 states. These are generally travelers returning from Puerto Rico. There is an isolated suggestion of a primary case, secondary case from mosquito bite in Miami. It's difficult to prove, but this is how the West Nile virus started. Now, we're still in the summer, and I don't see Florida overrun with cases, so we might have lucked out this time. We'll see with time. July 2015, the MERS coronavirus, South Korea outbreak. This was quickly contained. July 10th, 2015, Legionnaire's outbreak in the South Bronx. Normally, this was transmitted by contaminated air conditioners, cooling towers. They're still looking for the source for this one. July 24th, Naegleria fowleri in the New Orleans water supply. This is the brain-eating amoeba you hear about from time to time. It was isolated from the water from the St. Bernard Parish neighborhood of New Orleans. It's tested positive for the second time in 2 years. They're undergoing testing right now to see if this is present anywhere else in the 225-mile system. And this thing serves 44,000 people in the New Orleans area, this particular branch. CDC says it's safe to drink the water. I don't want something that's going to kill me if it goes up my nose. I'm not going to drink that. All right, we'll tidy up here. Just a quick update on some other work we're involved with. The question of Borneo, several years ago, Indonesians went over and did surveys for avian flu among all sorts of animals in Borneo. What they found was that blood collected from 353 orangutans showed an 18.4% seropositivity for the Ebola virus. And we're talking the African strains. 6 out of 353 were seropositive also for Marburg virus. Now, we know Ebola restin, the non-pathogenic Ebola, is in the Philippines, and we would expect that. But a virus from Africa? That's a long way for a fruit bat to fly. Well, it turns out they found seropositivity in the same species of bat in Bangladesh. So we're now thinking Ebola may be a lot more widespread than we ever thought before. African cities are particularly at risk for infectious disease outbreaks because of their high density. The population, as I mentioned before, in southern Africa has doubled over the last 27 years. The infrastructure has not matched the population growth. Many African cities are characterized by extreme overcrowding, limited medical surge capacity, poor public health, sanitation, dysfunctional governments at all levels. Kenya's got a fairly good government, but here's their projected population growth by 2015 broken down into demographics. During the West Africa Ebola outbreak, a single infected case arrived by air at the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi, Kenya, got off the plane and promptly collapsed. The doctors ran away. And authorities had no idea how to respond to this incident, so they initiated a ban on all flights from West Africa. This is perplexing as Marburg virus, Ebola's relative, is endemic in Kenya. The Nairobi hospital has an infectious disease specialist, very good ones, and a special isolation unit for Marburg, a BSL-3 isolation unit. So we don't really understand the panic until you start looking at their public health capability, and they could only complete one leg of the triad. I was eventually contacted by the Kenyan National Disaster Medical Unit for urgent assistance in establishing an Ebola response capability. Looking at the website of the WHO, I found this quite curious because WHO was very proud to announce they were in Kenya training up a response team. Well, Dr. Ngombe, a very brilliant man, head of their Nairobi Hospital Infectious Disease Unit, he's never seen one person from WHO. No one's ever contacted him. We soon discovered that WHO is only training their own small staff in their Nairobi office. They're doing absolutely nothing to help Kenya prepare. Total contrast to what they're promoting on their website. So from December to February, we developed a training package. And by the way, it takes at least 40 hours to do a lecture, to develop one. So there was a lot of midnight work, this and that. And we went over there, and the idea was to at least get them to do the first part of the triad. The ability to go in, safely take a sample to confirm the case, dispose of the body, decontaminate the hut. So they gave me their best and brightest. This was at the cabinet level. This guy here was the runner-up to president of Kenya in the last election. Very interesting gentleman. So We train them how to do surveillance alert, how to make their own local decon solutions without having to buy expensive stuff. We worked with what they had on board already. How to do an incident response, how to pack their vehicles, how to take oral swabs from a suspected case or a dead body, how to bag the dead bodies correctly, and then safe burial procedures are very important. You can't just come in wearing funny suits into these villages. They have their own protocol. You wait at the edge of the village and you wait till somebody notices you and the chief sends a runner and you come in and you explain what's going on. These people are very set in burying their dead their way, and you start trying to take over, they'll kill you. And this happened in the West African outbreak. So they gave me a psychologist, and we did some role playing and a lot of exercises. And to explain, you sit down with the family and explain very carefully and clearly why this happened. And these are people that have no understanding of the germ theory of disease. So it requires a lot of interpersonal reaction. Anyway, we managed to set up their first Ebola response team. Everything from the ambulance drivers to security to the physicians involved to the actual response team. We'll be going back possibly in September or maybe a bit later to help them set up a mobile Ebola treatment where they can take this right in the middle of any outbreak that should occur, either of Ebola or Marburg. And then this new test kit's being developed by a private company. It uses room temperature reagents. You don't have to refrigerate it, and you get an answer in 10 minutes. So we'll be going back to train them in that so they can diagnose, is this a real case or not, from a dead body or a suspected, right at the site. Other things we're involved with, a big thought experiment that's been going on for the last 10 years. From 98 to 1999, we spent $70 million in the domestic preparedness program training hospitals how to manage bioterrorism. As you can see, there's nothing to show for it. It's gone. So obviously a new approach is needed. What if we centralized everything? And I started thinking, in an attack like this, you can expect huge numbers of casualties, like a biological attack or a terrorist attack. Who's good at managing thousands of casualties quickly? Probably the people that are in wars. So I went back and I started looking, how did they handle casualties in the Civil War? How did they handle it in all these little Battle of the Somme, 1916, they generated 33,392 casualties over this 4-day period. And they effectively managed these with hospital trains. World War I, this was continued in World War II, was continued. NATO train even had operating rooms on board. These have been discontinued since then. But that gave me an idea. Perhaps we can have these mobile BSL-4 patient care facilities and hook them to special trains. We estimate the first system could be constructed for $25 million. It would be capable of screening 10,000 individuals, isolating 300 cases for surveillance, and managing 20 severe ICU level safely under BSL-4 conditions. Some technology, this is the LSTAT, life support for trauma and transport, developed after the first Gulf War when our tanks outrun the medical support. We were in Iraq so quickly, or to the border of Iraq so quickly. This is a cholera bed. This is traditional. You cut a hole out the middle because these patients have fulminant diarrhea. It's all loaded with virus. It's highly infectious. You put a bucket underneath. Well, this technology, it's a self-contained ICU. And they've made a cheaper version. I was involved a little bit with this, and as a reward, I got 2.5 hours in the B-2 stealth bomber simulator. We bombed Reno. Then I got to thinking a bit more. There's all sorts of natural disasters that create large numbers of casualties. Earthquakes, it's in the several, 20,000. China has horrendous incidents. So why don't we make this a multi-purpose system, adaptable to different types of disasters? You pull the train in here. It can even carry a DepMed's Army hospital. It's a quick setup hospital. National Guard CST teams, these were designed 10 years ago for chemical and biological terrorism. They're still around. They still train. So why don't we put them in charge of the trains? Maybe one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. But you've got people that constantly train, constantly rehearse. You can put the National Pharmaceutical Stockpile on there, and you can tailor-make this train to the incident, depending on what sort of Katrina or what sort of disaster. And you make it intermodal dimensions, so these cars can be shipped by train, plane, or ship. Other work, we're trying to bring back this Rakel-style positive pressure ensemble, where air blows over your face and into the suit. It puffs the suit out. If you get a tear in your suit, you see it. You lose your puffiness. And these are safe. USAID is now I've talked to several of these manufacturers over the last year. USAID is now taking bids for prototype manufacturing. This will be the new suit with a large clear visor. And we've repositioned this zipper in the back with very big pull tabs, and the idea is you can get out of this suit yourself without risk of touching the outside of the garment. Although it's decontaminated, you still don't want to touch it, okay? I think this will be the answer. In tropical environments, that airflow that keeps your suit puffy also keeps you cool. Right now, with the Médecins Sans Frontières ensemble, you can only work about 15 minutes in that thing. So you're quadrupling the number of healthcare workers you need to provide round-the-clock care to these patients. And then the last proposal I'm kind of excited about. I looked at a database of 335 emerging infectious disease origins from 1940 to 2004, and you see a non-random pattern of RNA viral disease outbreaks. And these are all associated with biodiversity hotspots. Unfortunately, one, these hotspots are home to the world's 1.2 billion poorest people, and two, over 90% of the major armed conflicts between 1950 and 2000 have occurred within these regions. In 1965, an innovative concept was developed for field medicine. They took some Green Beret medics. Now, these are very highly trained soldiers, right? Fighting soldiers from the sky, thank John Wayne. And they trained them up to essentially be epidemiologists with guns. They could defend themselves. It was designated this very big, long U.S. Army Special Forces Walter Reed Army Institute of Research Field Epidemiology Survey Team Airborne. We call it Rare Fest. They deployed to Vietnam and conducted numerous field surveys for typhus, plague, other arthropod-borne diseases, gastrointestinal disorders, bilharzia, or schistosomiasis, and malaria resistance, all under combat conditions. The unit was eventually disbanded when helicopters became widespread in aeromedical transport by helicopter. But they proved the worth and they proved the concept. From 1978 to 2000, we had the aeromedical isolation team at Fort Detrick. This was a military rapid response team, worldwide airlift. They were designed to go into these weird areas, bring a patient out in an isolator transport unit under BSL level 4 confinement, made it to the specialized patient care center at Fort Detrick, which no longer exists, and you're surrounded by the laboratories that can figure out what disease you have. This is the military funding and the Obama sequestration, and this is decommissioned. The concept is to reform this team, both teams, and combine them into one. Give them the capability for rapid insert into a conflict area with self-protection. They carry weapons. Able to collect remote area epidemiological intelligence, perform rapid diagnosis in the field, conduct field epidemiological surveys, contact tracing, patient isolation, and be able to provide any time-sensitive treatments. Things that, okay, we've got the triple antibody cocktail, you've got Ebola, you need to get it now. So that goes with them. And then conduct critical care isolation and transport of human cases for future care and study. There's two options for this. One is to create a DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency task unit, on 24/7 standby. This was previously done for a team called the Dead ST-1 that snuck into Laos, classified, and looked at the yellow rain outbreak, suspected Soviet munitions. They found advanced detergent residue on the foliage. That doesn't exist in nature. The agent had long ago, it was a mycotoxin, we believe, that the Soviets used. The Dead ST-2, I was involved in this with then Major Murphy. It was to train up a special operations WMD search for Iraq and Afghanistan. Or you can do it independent contractor based, private with DIA cooperation. And this would obviously have to generate some sort of revenue through government contracts. So it would probably have other uses and missions as well. Anyway, the basic idea, when you have a defense, boy, I want my Claymore mines really far out there. The farther out it is, the more layered defense I can make. And the idea is to stop it here before it arrives here. Well, thank you very much.
I've been skeptical about the value of the annual flu shots for many years, so I haven't gotten any for a couple decades. I wonder if you might comment on whether those are useful or not.
I don't get them. Well, I take that back. Peck and I had one, 3 years ago or something, and that turned out to be the year they actually missed the flu strain that was involved.
Yeah, I don't get them either. And I was just going to say, I added up the statistics looking at their own data from the FDA. And really, considering that people are already somewhat immune and that they might miss the antigen and that you might make an antibody response and various other factors, it came out, when you multiply those together, it was a 10% chance that you benefited. So, you know, and when you read what they say about the immune boosts that they put in these vaccines, they say things like, well, QX234, we don't really know what it does, but man, does it really stimulate the immune system, and we're pretty sure it's safe. And, you know,
I do a lot for your rheumatoid. That said, if you have chronic respiratory disease, you really don't need influenza. So if there is a chance, it might help.
Now, I had a question about the flu pandemic, because I had heard it said that they thought that the flu vaccine was actually making us probably more at risk because, like in the 1918, it was the people that had natural immunity that survived, the older people that survived, the young people that didn't, and that the flu vaccines are not giving us, I don't know what you thought about that or if you'd heard about that.
There was this concept up until recently of what's called a cytokine storm. Right? Like in toxic shock syndrome, where your own immune system starts releasing vast quantities of inflammatory mediators, and it's your own immune system that kills you. Like if Lee mentioned lipopolysaccharide, you inject that into a mouse, it'll die within a very short period of time. Its own immune system kills it. Your capillary beds become leaky and inflamed throughout your body. It's called systemic inflammatory response syndrome and this type of thing. And up until recently, there was a thought that this virus was promoting a cytokine storm. That idea is dying down a little bit now. And although the virus has been sequenced and looked at and recreated in the laboratory by some lunatics, we're still not sure of the pathogenesis here.
Not sure I want to hear the answer to this, but how well prepared are our international airports in this country?
Well, how long did it take us to put in thermal scans into JFK?
I don't know.
You know they're on 24/7 in Singapore? Singapore learned a big lesson from the SARS outbreak. Now, Singapore is a little bit totalitarian. You spit on the sidewalk, they'll cane you. Okay? You drop chewing gum on, they'll cane you. But they kept that thing under control, and it could have turned into a disaster in Singapore. And they had those thermal scanners up and running within a day of the outbreak. Also, they would send you home if you were running a temperature, but unlike we do here, they would phone you every hour, and if you weren't there, the cops came by to arrest you, and you got caned.
It sounds like you said that we're not very well prepared.
No. It took us too long these scanners should have gone in right away. Because you know what? You can quarantine a country, you can do anything you want. You're still going to get cases come in. It's modern air travel. Now, government doesn't, but I like the idea of quarantine. 3 cases took 10,000 contact tracing to deal with. What if we'd had 100 Ebola cases come in here? We don't have enough people to do that. And that's how the thing starts to get out of control. Thank you very much.